At 6:47 a.m. on February 21, 1991, the lead M1A1 Abrams tanks of the 2nd Armored Division's 1st Brigade began their breach operation through Iraqi defensive berms along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, advancing toward 16 identified enemy infantry positions across a minefield that intelligence reports estimated at 400 meters deep. The vehicles were equipped with mine plows, massive steel blades designed to push anti-tank mines aside like snow, a defensive engineering solution that most armor commanders considered adequate insurance rather than critical protection. Within 90 minutes, if the breach corridors were not secured and marked, the entire ground offensive timeline for Operation Desert Storm would begin to slip, potentially exposing thousands of vehicles to concentrated artillery fire in the kill zones. Field manuals and armor school doctrine predicted mine plows would clear paths at speeds of 35 kilometers per hour, treating the devices as simple mechanical solutions to a manageable problem. This was the documented moment when institutional confidence in brute force engineering met the reality of sophisticated defensive mine warfare, and when the United States military would be forced to acknowledge that underestimating the complexity of minefield operations could paralyze even the most technologically advanced armored formations in modern warfare. The morning sky over the Wadi al-Batin Tactical Assembly Area carried the acrid residue of diesel exhaust and burning oil from Kuwaiti fields to the north. For 6 weeks, coalition air forces had pummeled Iraqi positions with over 100,000 sorties, but the ground war, the decisive phase that would determine whether Iraqi forces could be expelled from Kuwait, had not yet begun. Intelligence estimates suggested Iraqi engineers had laid between 500,000 and 1.5 million mines along the Kuwait-Saudi border, creating barrier belts that ranged from simple single-row obstacles to complex, overlapping defensive zones incorporating anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, wire obstacles, fire trenches, and pre-registered artillery kill zones. The dismissal of mines as a serious tactical problem had deep institutional roots. American armor doctrine, refined during decades of Cold War planning for mechanized warfare in Central Europe, emphasized speed, firepower, and maneuver. Mines were considered a nuisance, obstacles that slowed advances but rarely stopped them. Training scenarios at the National Training Center in California and the Combat Maneuver Training Center in Germany typically featured minefield breaching as a checkbox exercise. Attach plows to tanks, drive through the marked lanes, continue the attack. The emphasis was always on maintaining momentum. Senior commanders viewed the Iraqi mine belts through this doctrinal lens. Briefings at Central Command headquarters in Riyadh characterized the barriers as extensive but surmountable. The prevailing assessment held that Iraqi engineers, while industrious, lacked the sophistication to create truly complex obstacles. After all, American intelligence had observed the mine-laying operations from satellites and reconnaissance aircraft. The pattern seemed straightforward: linear belts running parallel to the border with predictable spacing and depth. This confidence extended to the equipment. Mine plows and mine rollers, heavy cylindrical devices pushed ahead of tanks to detonate pressure-fused mines, had been tested extensively. The M1A1 Abrams itself was considered nearly invulnerable, its composite armor capable of defeating most anti-tank weapons in the Iraqi arsenal. The Abrams weighed 63 tons. Iraqi mines, primarily Soviet-designed TM-62 and TM-46 models, required 200–400 kilograms of pressure to detonate. The mathematics seemed to favor the attackers. But mathematics on paper rarely accounts for the chaos of implementation under fire. To understand why American commanders underestimated the minefield threat, one must examine the institutional culture that shaped U.S. armor tactics in the years leading to Desert Storm. The Army's premier doctrinal manual, FM 105 Operations, emphasized air-land battle, a concept built on speed, deep strikes, and the disruption of enemy formations before they could concentrate their forces. Mines in this framework were static defenses that mobile, aggressive forces could bypass or breach rapidly. The maneuver warfare philosophy had been validated, in American eyes, by the 1973 Yom Kippur War and various NATO exercises. Israeli armor, despite suffering heavy casualties in the initial days of that conflict, had ultimately broken through Syrian and Egyptian defensive lines. The lesson drawn by American planners was not that mines were effective, but that determined attackers with superior technology could overcome prepared defenses through combined arms coordination and relentless pressure. Equipment procurement reflected this mindset. The Army invested heavily in mine plows and rollers, but these were treated as accessories rather than mission-critical systems. By 1990, the inventory of mine-clearing equipment was sufficient for divisional operations, but barely. More importantly, training time devoted to breaching operations remained minimal compared to gunnery, maneuver tactics, and combined arms exercises. The M1 Abrams tank could mount an M9 Armored Combat Earthmover Blade or tow a mine-clearing line charge Miklik, a rocket-propelled explosive line that could blast a path through a minefield by detonating mines through overpressure. But these systems had limitations that peacetime exercises rarely exposed. The M9 blade added weight and reduced speed. MICLIC required careful positioning and created only narrow lanes, 8 meters wide at best, through which entire tank columns would have to funnel. Each MICLIC trailer carried only 2 line charges, meaning a single vehicle could clear at most 2 lanes before requiring resupply. Intelligence collection during Desert Shield, the build-up phase from August 1990 to January 1991, provided detailed information about Iraqi defensive preparations. Aerial reconnaissance photographed trench lines, berms, and the telltale disturbed earth that indicated mine-laying activity. But photographic intelligence could not determine mine density, depth of burial, or the presence of anti-handling devices, secondary fuses designed to detonate mines when engineers attempted to clear them. Human intelligence was scarce. Iraqi defensive doctrine was derived from Soviet military theory, which emphasized defense in depth with extensive use of mines and obstacles. Soviet tactical manuals prescribed complex minefield patterns, initial belts to canalize attackers into kill zones, secondary belts to stop penetrations, and reserve minefields to contain breakthroughs. But American intelligence analysts, focused on Iraqi tank formations and artillery positions, devoted less attention to engineering preparations. The assumption was that coalition air superiority would suppress Iraqi engineers and that any mine barriers, however extensive, could be breached through standard procedures. This assumption would prove catastrophically optimistic. The Iraqi defensive system along the Kuwait-Saudi border represented years of engineering effort. Beginning in August 1990, immediately after the invasion of Kuwait, Iraqi military engineers began constructing what they called the Saddam Line, a barrier system stretching over 200 kilometers from the Persian Gulf coast westward into the desert. The system incorporated multiple defensive elements arranged in overlapping layers. The first obstacle encountered by attacking forces would be a sand berm, typically 3-4 meters high, bulldozed from desert sand and compacted enough to prevent vehicles from easily crossing. Behind the berm lay the first minefield belt, usually 100-200 meters deep, containing anti-tank mines spaced at intervals designed to ensure any vehicle crossing the belt would detonate at least one mine. These mines were not randomly scattered but carefully positioned in patterns, some in straight lines to catch vehicles moving perpendicular to the border, others in staggered rows to catch flanking movements. Beyond the first minefield lay a second berm and often a fire trench, a ditch filled with crude oil that could be ignited to create a wall of flame. Iraqi engineers calculated that this obstacle would force vehicles to slow down or halt, making them vulnerable to anti-tank guided missiles and artillery fire from prepared positions. The second minefield belt, positioned 501,000 meters beyond the first, incorporated anti-personnel mines interspersed with anti-tank mines. This combination was designed to complicate breaching operations. Engineers attempting to clear lanes for tanks would trigger anti-personnel mines, while vehicles attempting to push through would hit anti-tank mines. In some sectors, Iraqi engineers added a third element, nuisance minefields laid in irregular patterns between the main belts. These shallow fields contained smaller mines and were intended to create uncertainty, forcing attackers to slow down and probe carefully rather than charging through at speed. The sophistication of this system was not immediately apparent to American planners. Aerial photographs showed the berms and the disturbed earth of minefield belts, but the three-dimensional complexity, the overlapping fields of fire, the channelization of movement corridors into pre-registered artillery zones, the anti-personnel mines waiting for engineers, could not be fully appreciated from reconnaissance imagery. Coalition ground commanders tasked with planning the breach operations worked from intelligence estimates that proved both accurate and misleading. Accurate in identifying the existence and approximate locations of minefields, misleading in conveying the operational challenge of breaching them under combat conditions. The plan developed by VII Corps, the main coalition armored formation, called for 16 separate breach operations to be executed simultaneously along a 150-kilometer front. Each breach would require engineers to clear lanes through the minefields using mine plows, mine rollers, and MICLICs, while combat engineers marked the lanes with engineer tape and chemical lights. Infantry would follow to secure the far side of the obstacles, and then the main tank formations would pour through to begin the exploitation phase. On paper, the plan was elegant. In execution, it would reveal every assumption that had been made about the ease of breaching prepared defenses. The ground war began at 4:00 a.m. on February 24, 1991. The 1st Infantry Division mechanized, the Big Red One, had been assigned the critical mission of conducting the first major breach operation in the VII core sector. This was not a mission given to the division by chance. The 1st Infantry Division had spent months training for breaching operations and possessed the largest concentration of mine-clearing equipment in theater. At 6:38 a.m., 9 minutes before the 2nd Armored Division began its breach to the east, the 1st M1A1 Abrams tanks of the 1st Infantry Division, fitted with mine plows, approached the Iraqi berm system designated as Obstacle Belt 1. The lead tank from Company A, 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor Regiment, reached the first berm without incident. The commander gave the order to proceed. The tank accelerated, its mine plow, a massive V-shaped blade mounted on the front of the hull, digging into the sand as the vehicle climbed the berm. At the crest, the tank hesitated as the driver adjusted throttle to control the descent down the far side. The plow bit deep, pushing sand and presumably any mines in its path off to the sides. Behind the lead tank, a 2nd Abrams, also equipped with a mine plow, followed at a 50-meter interval. The plan called for each plow-equipped tank to clear a lane 4 meters wide, with combat engineers following to mark the cleared lanes with engineer tape and chemical lights. Infantry fighting vehicles and additional tanks would then use these marked lanes to transit the minefield. The first indication that the plan was failing came not from an explosion but from a radio call. At 6:52 a.m., the lead tank reported that its mine plow had struck something that stopped the vehicle's forward momentum. The driver had applied more throttle, but instead of pushing through, the plow was digging deeper into the sand. The tank was bogged down. The 2nd tank maneuvered to bypass the 1st, moving approximately 10 meters to the left of the cleared lane. At 6:54 a.m., it detonated a mine. The explosion, a TM-62P anti-tank mine containing 7.5 kilograms of TNT, blew the right track off the tank and damaged the road wheels. The tank was immobilized, but the crew was uninjured. Within 8 minutes of beginning the breach, 2 tanks were disabled in the minefield. Neither had been destroyed by enemy fire, both had been stopped by the mines themselves. The problem was immediately apparent to engineers observing from command vehicles. The mine plows were not functioning as designed. In training exercises conducted in Saudi Arabia during Desert Shield, the plows had performed adequately, pushing training mines, inert devices with the same size and weight as live mines, aside without difficulty. But the actual Iraqi minefields presented conditions the training had not replicated. First, the mines were buried deeper than expected, some as deep as 30 centimeters below the surface, compared to the 10-15 centimeters typical of hasty minefields. The mine plow blades, designed to skim the surface and catch mines in their shallow buried positions, were passing over some mines entirely. Second, the sand in the operational area was finer and softer than the training areas. When mine plows dug in, they created bow waves of sand that piled up in front of the blade, increasing resistance and slowing the tanks. In some cases, the accumulated sand was heavy enough to stall the tank's forward progress entirely. Third, some Iraqi mines had been fitted with tilt-rod fuses, vertical rods extending above the mine that would trigger detonation if disturbed. These fuses were designed to defeat mine plows. Even if the plow blade passed over the mine body, the rod would catch on the blade or the tank's hull, detonating the mine beneath or beside the vehicle. By 7:15 a.m., 4 tanks of the 1st Infantry Division were immobilized in or around Obstacle Belt 1. Engineers attempting to move forward on foot to mark lanes and assess the situation were pinned down by Iraqi small arms fire from bunkers on the far side of the obstacle belt. The breach operation, planned to take 90 minutes, had stalled in less than 40 minutes. Similar reports began arriving from other breach sites along the VII core front. The 2nd Armored Division, attacking through Obstacle Belt 2 to the east, reported 3 tanks disabled by mines in the first hour. The 3rd Armored Division, breaching further north, reported mines detonating under vehicles that had supposedly transited cleared lanes, indicating that the mine plows were missing mines, or that Iraqi engineers had laid mines in irregular patterns designed specifically to defeat plowing operations. The scope of the problem was becoming clear. The American military, with the most advanced tank force in the world, was being stopped not by enemy tanks or artillery, but by a defensive technique as old as warfare itself. Colonel Samuel Rains, commander of the 1st Infantry Division's Engineer Brigade, faced a crisis that no amount of training or doctrine could have fully prepared him for. His engineer battalions, the 9th Engineer Battalion and the 707th Engineer Battalion, had trained extensively for breaching operations, But the reality of executing 16 simultaneous lane clearances through complex, defended minefields under fire was exposing every limitation in equipment, doctrine, and technique. The immediate problem was threefold. Disabled vehicles were blocking lanes, making it impossible for follow-on forces to advance. Engineer teams attempting to manually proof lanes, detecting mines with handheld detectors, were taking casualties from Iraqi defensive fire. And mine plows, the primary mechanical clearing system, were proving unreliable. Rains ordered a temporary halt to the breach operations in his sector at 7:30 a.m. This was not a decision made lightly. The entire ground offensive was timed to a precise schedule. Delays in the breach would cascade through the operational plan, potentially giving Iraqi forces time to reposition reserves or launch counterattacks. But continuing to push tanks into minefields that were not being effectively cleared would result in unacceptable losses. The solution Rains proposed was a return to a technique that had been largely abandoned in favor of mine plows: the Mine Clearing Line Charge, MICLIC. The MICLIC system consisted of a 5-inch diameter rocket that pulled a 350-foot line charge containing 1,750 pounds of C4 explosive. When detonated, the line charge created an overpressure wave that would sympathetically detonate mines along a path roughly 8 meters wide and 100 meters long. MICLIC had fallen out of favor for several reasons. It was slow to emplace. Each line charge required the launch vehicle to halt, aim the rocket, fire, and then wait for the detonation before moving forward. It created a relatively narrow lane, forcing vehicles to move in single file. And the system was in short supply. The entire VII Corps had fewer than 200 MICLIC line charges available for the initial breach operations. But MICLIC had one critical advantage: it worked. Unlike mine plows, which relied on mechanical contact with mines and could be defeated by deep burial or irregular placement, MICLIC destroyed mines through overpressure. It didn't matter if the mine was buried 10 centimeters or 30 centimeters deep, the explosive wave would set it off. At 7:45 a.m., Rains gave the order to shift tactics. Engineer vehicles equipped with MICLIC would take the lead, firing line charges to blast initial lanes through Obstacle Belt 1. Mine plow tanks would then follow through the MICLIC lanes, widening them to allow passage of larger formations. Combat engineers would mark the cleared lanes, and infantry would secure the far side before the main tank force pushed through. The decision represented a fundamental shift in doctrine. American armor tactics emphasized speed and momentum. MICLIC breaching was neither fast nor momentum-driven. It was methodical, deliberate, and time-consuming, but it worked. The first MICLIC was fired at 8:03 a.m. by an M113 armored personnel carrier from the 9th Engineer Battalion. The vehicle had maneuvered to within 100 meters of Obstacle Belt 1, positioning itself at a 45-degree angle to the minefield. The MICLIC launcher, mounted on the rear of the M113, elevated to firing position. The rocket motor ignited with a sharp crack, pulling the line charge out of its container in a long arc that extended over the minefield. For 3 seconds, the line hung in the air, a thin black serpent suspended above the sand. Then it fell. The detonation, when it came, was not a single explosion but a rolling wave of pressure that rippled along the 350-foot length of the charge. Sand and smoke erupted in a continuous blast that echoed across the desert. Secondary explosions followed as mines along the path sympathetically detonated. The sound was deafening, a sustained roar that lasted nearly 4 seconds. When the smoke cleared, a lane roughly 8 meters wide and 100 meters deep had been cleared through the minefield. The sand in the cleared area was scorched black and littered with fragments of destroyed mines. Combat engineers moved forward immediately, probing the edges of the lane with handheld mine detectors to ensure no mines had survived at the boundaries. At 8:14 a.m., a mine plow tank moved into the MICLIC lane and began plowing parallel to the cleared path, widening it. This time the plow worked as designed. With the heaviest concentration of mines already destroyed by the MICLIC, the plow encountered only occasional mines at the edges of the belt, pushing them aside without difficulty. By 8:45 a.m., the first fully cleared and marked lane through Obstacle Belt 1 was complete. Infantry fighting vehicles from the 1st Infantry Division moved through, their commanders watching the engineer tape markers that defined the safe corridor. On the far side, infantry dismounted and began clearing Iraqi bunkers, suppressing the defensive fire that had pinned down earlier engineer teams. The success of the MICLIC-led breach did not go unnoticed. By 9:00 a.m., reports of the 1st Infantry Division's successful lane clearance had reached VII Corps headquarters. Lieutenant General Frederick Franks Jr., the Corps commander, immediately ordered all breach operations to shift to MICLIC-led tactics where available. But the supply problem remained critical. The 1st Infantry Division had expended 6 MICLIC line charges to clear 4 lanes through Obstacle Belt 1. At that rate of consumption, the division would exhaust its MICLIC inventory before completing breaches through all 3 obstacle belts in its sector. Emergency resupply requests went out to core logistics, but MICLIC line charges could not be manufactured in the field. The inventory on hand was all that would be available for the immediate future. Engineers improvised. Some units began combining MICLIC with mine plows in tandem operations. A MICLIC would blast the initial lane, a mine plow would follow immediately to widen it, and a second mine plow would make a third pass to create a lane wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass side by side. This technique was slower than hoped but faster than purely manual proofing and more reliable than plows alone. Other units employed a technique called serpentine breaching, using multiple MICLIC shots at offset angles to create a zigzag pattern of cleared lanes that could be connected into a broader cleared area. This required more line charges but created wider, more flexible breach corridors. By noon on February 24, the breach operations across VII core front were proceeding, but behind schedule. The original plan had called for the breaches to be complete by 10:00 a.m., allowing the main armored formations to begin their exploitation attacks by midday. Instead, most breach sites were still working through the 1st or 2nd obstacle belts, and the main tank forces remained staged in assembly areas behind the Saudi border. The Iraqi defensive system had been designed with depth specifically to impose delays on attackers. Even if coalition forces breached the 1st obstacle belt, they would immediately encounter the 2nd belt, forcing them to repeat the time-consuming breach process. Iraqi planners had calculated that this layered defense would buy time for reserves to reposition and for artillery to engage attackers caught in the killing zones between obstacle belts. At 1:30 p.m., lead elements of the 1st Infantry Division reached Obstacle Belt 2. Initial reconnaissance by engineer teams indicated this belt was more complex than the 1st, wider, estimated at 300 meters deep versus 200 meters for Belt 1, with higher mine density and incorporating anti-personnel mines throughout rather than just at the edges. The presence of anti-personnel mines complicated the breach operation significantly. Soldiers on foot, including combat engineers, faced the risk of triggering small mines that would not destroy a tank but would inflict severe injuries. Standard anti-personnel mines like the Soviet PMN required only 5.8 kilograms of pressure to detonate. A dismounted soldier would trigger these mines easily. The tactical solution was to minimize the need for dismounted operations. MICLIC line charges would clear the bulk of the lanes, and infantry would remain mounted in their fighting vehicles until the far side of the obstacle belt was reached. Engineers would conduct only minimal manual proofing, focusing on confirming that MICLIC lanes were clear rather than attempting to detect every mine in the belt. This approach accepted risk. Some mines might survive the MICLIC blast, particularly at the edges of the cleared lanes, but the alternative extensive manual proofing under fire posed greater risk to personnel and would take far longer. At 2:05 p.m., the 1st Infantry Division began firing MICLIC into Obstacle Belt 2. The 2nd belt proved more resistant than the 1st. The deeper mine density meant that MICLIC explosions triggered more secondary detonations, but also left more unexploded mines at the periphery. Mine plow tanks following the MICLIC shots reported hitting mines more frequently, and 2 more tanks were immobilized, one with a thrown track, one with damaged suspension. By 4:00 p.m., 3 lanes had been cleared through Obstacle Belt 2 in the 1st Infantry Division's sector. The rate of advance was slower than through Belt 1, but the operation was proceeding. Infantry had secured the far side of the belt, and the division's lead armor battalions were beginning to move through the cleared lanes. The experience of the 1st Infantry Division was being replicated across the VII core front, with variations depending on the specific obstacle configurations in each sector. The 2nd Armored Division, operating further east, encountered obstacle belts that included fire trenches filled with crude oil. Engineers had to extinguish or bypass these trenches before vehicles could cross, adding another layer of complexity. The 3rd Armored Division, breaching in the northern sector, faced less dense minefields but more active Iraqi defensive fire. Artillery and mortar rounds fell on breach sites, forcing engineers to work under indirect fire while clearing lanes, a scenario that had been practiced in training but proved far more difficult in execution. What became evident by late afternoon on February 24 was that the breach operations, while successful, were consuming far more time than planned. The rapid armored exploitation that was supposed to characterize the coalition ground offensive had been delayed by 6 to 8 hours in most sectors. The pace of advance was being dictated not by tank speed, but by the methodical work of engineer units clearing lanes through complex minefields. The shift from mine-plow-centric tactics to MICLIC-led breaching represented an institutional adaptation under fire, a recognition that pre-war assumptions about the ease of breaching had been wrong. But the adaptation went beyond simply changing equipment priorities. It required rethinking the operational tempo of the entire ground offensive. At a commander's conference held via radio at 6:00 p.m. on February 24, Lieutenant General Franks addressed the breach delays directly. Intelligence reports indicated that Iraqi forces were not counterattacking and were showing limited ability to reinforce threatened sectors. The coalition air campaign had devastated Iraqi command and control, leaving frontline units isolated and unable to coordinate effective responses. This meant that the time lost to breaching, while frustrating, was not resulting in operational disadvantage. Iraqi forces were not exploiting the delays. The coalition could afford to breach methodically and thoroughly rather than rushing through with inadequate lane clearance and accepting higher casualties. Franks issued new guidance: prioritize thorough breaching over speed. Divisions were authorized to expand their use of MICLIC even if it meant further delays. Engineer units were given priority for resupply, including emergency airlifts of additional line charges from depots in Saudi Arabia. The decision was controversial among some armor commanders who chafed at the slow pace, but it proved operationally sound. By the evening of February 24, all major coalition formations had successfully breached through at least 2 obstacle belts and were positioned to begin exploitation attacks into the Iraqi rear areas. Casualties from mine strikes, while not insignificant, were far lower than they would have been if units had attempted to charge through the minefields using mine plows alone. The 1st Infantry Division completed breaching operations through all 3 obstacle belts in its sector by 9:00 p.m. on February 24. Total time for the complete breach: 14 hours, more than 3 times the original estimate. But the division had cleared 16 separate lanes, each wide enough for 2-vehicle traffic, and had sustained fewer than 20 casualties in the process. Not a single tank had been destroyed by mines, though 15 had been immobilized and later recovered. The experience of the 1st Infantry Division became the template for the remainder of the ground campaign. Other divisions adopted MICLIC-led breaching tactics, and engineer units became the critical enablers of the entire offensive rather than mere supporting elements. Iraqi defensive plans had relied heavily on the mine belts to slow and canalize coalition attacks. Iraqi commanders, drawing on Soviet defensive doctrine and their own experience from the Iran-Iraq War, believed that extensive minefields would impose delay and attrition on any attacker, buying time for mobile reserves to counterattack into the flanks of penetrations. The Iranian military, during the 1980-1988 war, had attempted numerous breaches of Iraqi defensive positions fortified with minefields. Iranian tactics had typically involved infantry-heavy assaults, with engineers clearing lanes under fire while infantry provided suppression. These breaches had been extremely costly, often requiring hours or days to complete and resulting in heavy casualties. Iraqi commanders anticipated that coalition forces would face similar difficulties. Intelligence assessments by the Iraqi General Staff estimated that American and British forces would require 24-48 hours to breach the obstacle belts along the Saudi border, during which time they would be vulnerable to artillery and counterattack. What Iraqi planners had not anticipated was the scale and effectiveness of the coalition air campaign. By February 24, Iraqi artillery units had been subjected to 6 weeks of continuous air attack. Ammunition dumps had been destroyed, fire direction centers had been bombed, and command communications had been severed. Iraqi artillery units that might have turned the breach sites into killing zones were largely unable to deliver effective fire. Similarly, Iraqi mobile reserves, armored and mechanized units positioned to counterattack breaches, had been attrited by airstrikes and were paralyzed by the destruction of their logistics networks. Fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, and the lack of coherent orders left these units incapable of executing the counterattack missions for which they had been positioned. The result was that coalition breach operations, while slower than planned, proceeded largely unopposed. Iraqi frontline units, isolated in their defensive positions and subjected to overwhelming firepower, could offer only sporadic resistance. Many units surrendered once coalition forces reached their positions, others withdrew or dispersed. The mine belts themselves, however, performed as designed. They slowed the coalition advance, imposed delays, and forced attackers to adopt methodical breaching tactics. The problem, from the Iraqi perspective, was that the delays did not translate into operational advantage because the Iraqi military system as a whole had been paralyzed by air attack. The breaching operations of February 24-26, 1991, forced a comprehensive reassessment of U.S. Army doctrine on mine warfare and obstacle breaching. After-action reports compiled in the months following Desert Storm documented the shortcomings of pre-war planning and the adaptations that had been necessary. The most significant finding was the inadequacy of mine plows as a standalone breaching solution. Mine plows had been issued to mechanized units based on the assumption that they would be sufficient for most breaching scenarios. The reality of Iraqi minefields, deep burial, irregular patterns, tilt-rod fuses, had defeated mine plows in many instances. MICLIC, which had been treated as a secondary system, proved to be the most reliable method for creating initial breach lanes. But MICLIC had its own limitations: slow to employ, narrow lanes, limited inventory. The inventory problem was particularly acute. VII Corps had begun the ground offensive with 179 MICLIC line charges. By the end of February 26, when President George H.W. Bush ordered a ceasefire, only 43 line charges remained. If the war had continued for another week, coalition forces would have exhausted their MICLIC stockpile entirely. The doctrinal response was immediate. In 1992, the U.S. Army published updated breaching doctrine in FM 9013-1, Combined Arms Breaching Operations. The new manual elevated MICLIC to primary status for breaching dense minefields and emphasized deliberate methodical breaching over speed. It also mandated increased training time for breaching operations and called for expanded inventories of MICLIC and other specialized breaching equipment. Equipment procurement shifted as well. The Army accelerated development of the M1 Assault Breacher Vehicle, ABV, a specialized engineer tank equipped with both mine plows and a full-width mine roller, as well as an integrated MICLIC launcher. The ABV was designed specifically to address the limitations exposed in Desert Storm, combining mechanical and explosive breaching capabilities in a single platform. Training at the National Training Center and other facilities was revised to include more realistic minefield scenarios, incorporating deep-buried mines, irregular patterns, and defended obstacles. The emphasis shifted from treating breaching as a supporting task to recognizing it as a critical mission that could determine the success or failure of entire operations. The institutional change went beyond equipment and doctrine to encompass organizational culture. Engineer units, traditionally seen as support elements, gained recognition as decisive combat enablers. Career paths for engineer officers were enhanced, and engineer assignments to key staff positions increased. The lesson had been absorbed. In modern warfare, obstacles and minefields could stop even the most powerful mechanized forces, and the ability to breach effectively was as important as firepower or maneuver. By February 28, 1991, when the ceasefire took effect, coalition forces had advanced over 250 kilometers into Iraq and Kuwait, liberated Kuwait City, and effectively destroyed the Iraqi military as a coherent fighting force. The ground campaign had lasted 100 hours, 4 days of continuous offensive operations that shattered Iraqi defensive lines and rooted Iraqi armored formations. The breaching operations that enabled this rapid advance received relatively little attention in the triumphalist narratives that followed. Media coverage focused on tank battles, airstrikes, and the speed of the coalition advance. The methodical, unglamorous work of engineer units clearing lanes through minefields did not make for dramatic headlines. But within military circles, the significance of the breaching operations was well understood. Coalition forces had faced one of the most extensive minefield systems ever emplaced, and they had overcome it through adaptation, persistence, and the effective employment of engineer capabilities. The fact that casualties from mines had been relatively low, fewer than 100 coalition personnel killed or wounded by mine strikes during the entire ground campaign, was testament to the effectiveness of the breaching tactics that had been developed under fire. The Iraqi mine belts, dismissed by some pre-war planners as a nuisance, had in fact imposed significant operational delays and forced a fundamental rethinking of American armor tactics. The institutional confidence in mine plows and mechanical breaching had been proven unfounded. The reality was more complex. Breaching defended, complex minefields required specialized equipment, deliberate planning, and a willingness to accept slower operational tempo in exchange for reduced casualties and assured success. This lesson would be relearned in different contexts in subsequent conflicts. In Iraq in 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, coalition forces again encountered minefields, though less extensive than in 1991. In Afghanistan, improvised explosive devices, a form of mine warfare adapted by insurgents, would pose a persistent threat to coalition vehicles and dismounted patrols. The doctrine and equipment developed in response to Desert Storm would provide the foundation for countering these threats. But the adaptations would need to continue. The fundamental truth remained. Obstacles and mines, properly employed, could slow or stop even technologically superior forces. The counter to this was not speed or brute force, but methodical breaching operations executed by well-trained engineers with effective equipment. It was a lesson as old as siege warfare, forgotten in the confidence of mechanized mobility and relearned at 6:47 a.m. on February 21, 1991, when the first mine plow tank of the 2nd Armored Division entered an Iraqi minefield and the institutional assumptions of modern armor doctrine met the reality of deliberate defensive engineering. The legacy was not one of heroic individuals but of institutional learning, a military organization confronting its own overconfidence and adapting its doctrine, equipment, and tactics based on battlefield experience. The mines were not harmless. They were never harmless. And the tank regiments that got stuck in the minefields on that February morning forced an entire military to acknowledge what engineers had always known: that obstacles, properly designed and defended, remain one of the most effective tools of warfare, capable of imposing delay and attrition far out of proportion to their cost and complexity. In the quiet spaces of Army staff colleges and engineer schools, the breaching operations of Desert Storm are studied not as a triumph of technology, but as a case study in the need for intellectual humility in the face of battlefield reality. The story is told not through the lens of individual heroism, but through the lens of systems, procedures, and the unglamorous work of engineers clearing lanes under fire so that others could advance. That is the documented legacy, not a tale of underestimation vindicated by a lone hero, but an institution forced to adapt or fail and choosing slowly, methodically under pressure to adapt.